So today I'm going to be discussing 6 emergency preparedness lessons based on the movie, which is based on the book, Leave the World Behind. All right, so first, the remote location for sheltering in place. What are the pros and cons? So as you know in the movie, if you've seen it already, GH and his daughter go back to what their original home is, out of the city into a countryside near the ocean, near Long Island. Now, the advantage of staying in the city would be you have much more resources than you would have in that remote oceanside Long Island location. You also have the community, you have an easier chance of spreading information peer to peer, but that's about it. There are overwhelming disadvantages to staying in a crowded, urban, congested environment. And some of those disadvantages are that you become vulnerable to mobs that are going to be roaming, looking desperately for any kind of supplies that they can find. By going to a remote location, such as GH's friend Danny has, he has a homestead that he has the ability to protect. He has emergency supplies that one of the characters, Amanda, saw Danny preparing. Now, this is presumably a fictional account. It's a fictional movie based on a fictional book. The lessons are very real, very important, because nobody is going to need any of these emergency supplies until they need them. And when they need them, there is nothing that is more important. So a lot of these skills in prepping in this movie, people don't take seriously. And as one, quick anecdote, I recently got back from a trip to Tahoe, and the chains that we had to put on the tires were something that I had never done before. Now, it was a lot harder than it otherwise would have been, learning how to do it in the snow in 11-degree weather at night. If I would have had the foresight to practice this just at least one time, putting on the chains at the house when I could watch a YouTube video, internet was available, I wasn't freezing, I wasn't on the side of the road at night, it would have been immensely better. All that would take is just a little bit of preparation. And furthermore, if I had purchased the chains earlier, I wouldn't have had to spend 4 times as much. Fortunately, I was even able to get those. Now imagine if it's something as serious as like first aid, which they touch on in this movie. Imagine how much you're going to have to spend if you can even get it. There's going to be a dwindling amount of supplies, and there are going to be fewer every single day. You saw what happened during the pandemic, where a very finite amount of toilet paper, of paper towels, was rapidly getting depleted because not only were the shelves in the stores not getting replenished, but you had individuals hoarding it because they didn't know when they were either going to be able to get it again, or they had nefarious purposes and they knew they were going to be able to resell it for a very unscrupulous profit. So you're burning the candle at both ends. This is why preparation is obviously important. So also on that remote location, for the shelter in place, Danny, the contractor, the prepper guy, was seen stockpiling bottled water and canned goods. Now that is certainly better than nothing, but what's better than stockpiling water and stockpiling canned goods is storing the ability to generate your own water, purify your own water, as well as utilize the abundance of resources around you in the form of perhaps hunting the deer that sporadically popped up in a huge herd of them, probably over 100. So the point is, if you store water, you have a finite supply. If you store the ability to purify water, to hunt game, and to prep it, cook it, and store it, then presumably you will be able to eat indefinitely. There will be an inexhaustible supply of wildlife out there for you to hunt and kill and eat and store if you have some of the basic tools available stored already. So that's another advantage of having a shelter-in-place location that is remote, that is away from just a congested city center where it's predictably going to be chaos. There might be, a FEMA camp, but you think that's not going to be totally chaotic. If you can shelter in place and if you have a location that is in a relatively rural, secure area where you have stored supplies and self-defense to protect what you've stored, you're generally better off. This is why you want to start thinking now, if you live in an urban area, what are 3 to 5 alternate locations that you could flee to? Perhaps you have a housing swap with somebody who lives in the countryside. You have keys to their house, they have keys to your house, knowing that if there's a tsunami, if you live near the coast like I do, or there's an earthquake and you have to evacuate, assume that the hotels will be unavailable. Assume that you will have to vacate. Assume that any government-provided camp or shelter is going to be chaotic, probably unsafe, and you're going to be stuck in lines, being treated the same as the thousands of other people that are in the same boat as you that don't deserve any priority treatment than you. Just as one side note, the reason Airbnb was created was because during one of those tech conferences years ago, they realized, Danny Chesky and his partner realized that there were no hotels that were reasonable. It was either all the hotels that were most expensive that were available, or there were no reasonably priced hotels. And pretty soon, all the expensive hotels filled up. That's how they created that business of Airbnb. And the relevance of that to this topic is that during a foreseeable event, which in that case was just a tech conference, in this context is an emergency, there is going to be a crunch for shelter. You're going to be competing against everybody else for a diminishing amount of resources. So what sets you apart is what you do about it now. Communications. So during the movie, you had an over-reliance on Wi-Fi. You saw how Amanda and her silly husband were trying to get the Wi-Fi to work. The daughter was complaining, and those are all trivial inconveniences until it becomes serious. Because as you saw from Amanda's phone, she couldn't get reliable information. She had a brief message, several messages that were perhaps emergency alerts, but then they disappeared and she couldn't get them back. So she had no reliable communication. It was just haphazard and chaotic. They were confused, they were panicked, and they didn't have any secondary or tertiary methods for emergency communication. So what can you do? Well, I recommend you consider a PACE plan. Now, PACE is an acronym, and it stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. So the way it works is like this. You'd have your primary method of communication, which for most of us would be our cell phone. Alternate might be the internet. We might be able to send text messages over the internet, iMessage, SMS. We might be able to send emails, VoIP. If that's down, then what's your contingency? Contingency is your third in line. So that might be satellite communications. But of course, in this movie, in this context, satellites were presumably compromised. And that, although is fictional in this movie, it's real for the real world. This country and China and many others, whether they admit it or not, they have the ability to compromise satellite communication, satellite-based GPS. All these capabilities exist now. And why wouldn't these countries use it if it would give them a strategic advantage during a conflict? So having a satellite communicator is great for just normal emergencies when cell towers are down or overloaded, as they were after 9/11. But furthermore, you need something in case all three of those are unavailable. And what could that be? Well, walkie-talkie or ham radio. So you have a few options for walkie-talkie, and I recommend GMRS because it's much better than the basic FRS. FRS is what you get at Walmart. You still can get something better than that, but FRS is like the cheapest walkie-talkie, very minimal range. Line of sight, 10 miles best, but probably lower than that. If there's any topographical features, cut that in half or even a quarter. But with GMRS, that's a much better walkie-talkie communication capability. And then lastly, ham. So that would all be part of the E, the emergency. Ham radio is something that is likened to a cockroach of communications in a positive sense, because cockroaches generally are the last to die. They survive almost everything. Ham radio is so robust and so resilient because of how it's structured. They use repeater stations throughout the country that are generally solar powered. So when all else fails, if you know how to operate a ham radio, which you can learn in less than a week and take your exam, and during an emergency, you can certainly listen. You can always use a ham radio to listen and get information from other people who have their boots on the ground and are relaying first-person information, people on that channel. But you can also broadcast if you have a license. And during an emergency, I shouldn't say this, but I'm sure the FCC has bigger fish to fry. So the point is, have all of those in mind. What are you going to do if your cell phone is lost, is broken, doesn't work, there's no cell signal? That shouldn't be your plan 1 of 1. That should be your plan 1 of 4. You want to have the ability to talk to your neighbors. So that's why it's great if you have neighbors that can either have walkie-talkies if they're close by, or ham radio. So you can set up some kind of neighborhood watch. So you're protecting yourselves. You're in a shared vulnerable environment, just like Danny when GH and the other guy, Clay, I think his name was, came to Danny's house. And Danny knew pretty obviously what they were there for. They needed some of his supplies that Danny had stored for himself. And because they didn't take this seriously, especially GH, because it was his house, they didn't have any emergency supplies, so they decided to go to someone who did. All right, next, lack of mobility. So in one of the scenes in the movie, the whole interstate was just congested with Teslas. Now, if you waited for a few seconds, you could see after that panning shot that it wasn't just Teslas, it was just cars everywhere that were completely congested, and that illustrates the point of lack of mobility and how to overcome that. So, as an anecdote, during the Maui fires, many people were stuck in their cars. They were not able to pass. They were not able to drive around the blockades because they were just in low clearance automobiles. Similar to the Paradise Fire in California a few years ago, people died in their cars trying to flee. So one of the solutions is to have a high clearance four-wheel drive, especially if you already have your go bag in the back or on a rooftop box. You can make a path when there otherwise isn't one. You can literally get around the danger, help your family flee to safety when everybody else is waiting like a lemming to just do what everybody else is doing. You have to sometimes be a salmon and go against the crowd. Otherwise, you're going to get the fate that everybody else gets. And if it's favorable, then go for it. But oftentimes, it's not. Otherwise, you might consider a cargo e-bike. Now, that could be an advantage because if there's like an EMP attack, for example, then you won't be able to start your car. You won't be able to use anything that's electronic, presumably. So all modern cars that are not carbureted are most likely going to be inoperable. But a cargo e-bike gives you a backup because if the motor and the battery and electrical system is not already fried, then you can use that to shuttle supplies to go into town. And if it is fried because of the EMP attack, well, you still have the conventional bicycle portion where you can pedal it. Many of these you can remove the battery, so it's really not that much heavier, just having that extra motor. But they're so overbuilt to handle the motor, to handle the cargo, that you can carry 4 to 6 bags of groceries. You could even carry a person in the back. You can outfit it to be a stretcher by towing one of those little kid carriers. Very versatile and much easier than getting a four-wheel drive vehicle that you don't already have or don't need, or having an extra vehicle just for emergency purposes. A cargo e-bike is going to be one of those dual-purpose emergency supplies that you use on a weekly basis, but also have it ready and prepped for an emergency. And also during that movie, there was a Spanish-speaking lady who was desperate for help. And that illustrates both lack of communication and lack of mobility. She was stuck on the side of the road. Nobody else was coming by. Clay was confused. He just drove off. He left her just in hopeless despair. And that also illustrates the point of not panicking, because when she is in that state of mind, she's presumably lost her ability to think clearly, to think rationally, and she's probably going to take on risks that she otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't. It illustrates the importance of learning how to control your emotions, to control your discomfort, and you're going to be exposed to things that you probably have never even thought of, let alone experienced. So the more you can gently introduce yourself to discomfort now, whether it's in the form of cold immersion or hunger and intermittent fasting, you're just putting more of the odds into your favor. Next, drinking water. So GH's home was near Long Island. And even though it's near the water, they presumably had no way to purify water from pipes, ponds, or pools. So they could have desalinated water if they had a portable desalinator, like something like the Quench C, which is a handheld portable desalinator, no electronics to break or get fried from an EMP attack, no batteries. It's just handheld, uses basically reverse osmosis to create unlimited water. So if you're near a salt water body, such as an ocean, if you're on either the coast of this country, then you have an unlimited supply of water. And if you live near swimming pools, if you have ponds, lakes, freshwater sources, as long as the swimming pools are not salt water, because that's unusable for both devices, as long as it's just freshwater pools, ponds, lakes, reservoirs, you also have a very large amount of water at the ready. And people in homes that have abandoned, that have fled, or maybe they've perished, unfortunately, they have water in their water heater, in their pipes, in the flush tank of their toilets, which I'm not talking about the bowl, the flush tank, multiple other places throughout the inside of their house and outside of their property, which you can filter, purify, make drinkable, make potable if you have a basic water purification system, such as a Berkey or one of the larger Nalgene gravity-fed water purifiers. So learn the difference between water purification and filtration. They're not the same. Learn the differences between chemical water purification, thermal water purification, mechanical water purification, and you will be able to control what is most important next to oxygen, which is water. And I didn't see anybody in GH's home have a problem with water. They sure were drinking a lot of wine and alcohol, but eventually they're going to run out of water. And why? Because they're dependent on the municipal water supply, that they assume that the water is going to keep running out of the taps. And it's not, as soon as the water treatment plant runs out of personnel or power or chemicals. So that is finite, just like storing water is finite. Store water, but also store the ability to purify water. Lack of first aid. So when Archie's teeth suddenly start falling out, neither of the families have any real first aid supplies or training. And this forces GH and Clay to make an unannounced visit to GH's prepper friend, Danny, who hardly seems to welcome the two, knowing that they're obviously there to beg for supplies that they didn't prep for themselves. So you're not going to be excited to have people come to your door and gradually consume the supplies that you stockpiled for your family and for yourself. So they didn't prepare and they became instantly vulnerable. And why would they assume that someone who did prepare would just be happy to fork over their finite amount of very important supplies? So what you can do now, in addition to just stockpiling the obvious first aid basics, is download some PDFs. Download first aid books so you can have them with you on your iPad or on your computer. You can print them out if you want, or just buy the physical book, whatever works in your preference. But I prefer to have them in electronic form on a Google Drive that I have saved for offline use on all my devices, so I can access it. And as I update the Google Drive on one computer, it updates everywhere else. And you can save all the files for offline usage, or you can just drag them to your desktop, whatever you prefer. Figure out what works best for you. And you can get emergency supplies. I'm talking about serious supplies like antibiotics from some company like Jace Medical, which will provide a quick background check. They ask you some questions, and you can get things like penicillin. I don't want to say the others because it might get me banned, but there are other medications that you can get that are somewhat were controversial during 2021. Look into it. It's a good idea to have. if there's more of an advantage to doing something than a disadvantage, it should be a no-brainer. What would be the disadvantage to having first aid supplies, even though you've never needed something like that before, because you always just go to the pharmacy and get what you needed? There are very few drawbacks to being prepared. Very few compared to the overwhelming advantages of having what you didn't know you needed until you needed it. It's always better to have than need. Better to have it, not need it, than need it, not have it, if that helps. So, self-defense, then we have one last slide. So fortunately for Danny, he was able to protect his stores. He was armed. And that protects the priceless stockpiles of emergency preparedness supplies when GH and Clay, just two examples in this case, came to look for emergency first aid equipment for Clay's son, who had his teeth starting to fall out for an unexplained reason. Now, fortunately, even as serious as teeth falling out and the ensuing infection, as serious as that is, it's still not as acute or serious as, massive hemorrhaging, or if they needed an AED because it goes into like VTAC. I assume there was probably no AED at the house. What would be the downside to having an AED? What would be the downside to having a single device that is probably the most life-saving single device that you could have? Probably even more so than a tourniquet. But a tourniquet also would be something to add to your first aid kit. These are all such low-hanging fruit, such small devices that have such profound importance, that what would be the good answer to not have these things? Even if you don't know how to use it yet, get it while you're thinking of it. Get an AED. For example, an AED is basically idiot-proof. You can't hurt somebody with it unless you've overridden all the safety protocols. It won't shock unless it reads the the VTAC or AFib, and it figures out that it actually needs a shock. If you have a normal resting heart rate, nothing will happen. Strap it on, press the button, and figure it out. You'll find out it doesn't do anything. And a tourniquet is a lot more technical, but get it now and then start to learn how to use it, because if you need it and don't have it, it's always worse than having it and using it maybe 80% correctly, but still correctly enough to save the person's life. The first step should be getting it, and then second step is learning as much as you can and then practicing with it. In summary, you need to have the option to have a remote location to bug out, and you should carry a bug out bag with you, even though you might have supplies or assume there will be supplies at your shelter-in-place location, because you might get stuck on the way, or when you get there, somebody might have already looted it. So bring your supplies, bring your bug out bag as a backup. Communication, have your PACE plan. Lack of mobility, have the ability to use other than the conventional roads, which are presumably going to be congested, blocked, or just unsafe. Drinking water, have the ability to generate your own, not just store it. First aid supplies and books, start acquiring those things now. Self-defense, if you cannot protect it, you will not keep it. And similar with communication, one more thing I wanted to say on that is it was extremely dangerous for GH and for Clay to go out on their own to try to acquire more information firsthand. Had they had a reliable PACE plan where they could have used alternate communications, they wouldn't have had to venture out at greater risk to themselves and possibly greater risk to the families that they left behind, because they could have maintained shelter, pooling their human resources together, which adds to their safety, and then communicate without having to venture out, which also emphasizes the importance of having supplies so you don't need to leave the protection of your shelter when you're sheltered in place. Every time you go out, you expose yourself to risk, and you expose those who you leave behind to probably even greater risk, which also feeds into why you need self-defense. So these all interrelate, and I wanted to use the film Leave the World Behind as a vehicle because it finally, I think, got people talking about emergency preparedness and less frivolously than they have in years past. And eventually, one of these things that happened in the movie is going to happen in real life. So if you think that you're going to wait until you're forced to prepare, does that make sense? And I think it's a rhetorical question. So if you found this helpful, I need you to let me know, because if nobody responds, then I'm not going to do any more of these. But it does take time, so I'm not going to make more of these if nobody's watching. I hope you found it helpful. Please let me know if you did.